Let me tell you about the most catastrophically awkward diplomatic incident in the recorded history of 14 star systems. My name is Vorith Kai, Senior Observation Analyst, 3rd Cast of the Interstellar Ethnographic Bureau, and I have been documenting human behavior for approximately 6 of their solar cycles. I have filed 942 reports. I have watched them eat questionable food combinations at 2 in the morning. I have watched them argue with automated customer service systems for 45 minutes over a $3 coupon. I have watched them sprint back to their car in the rain, reach the door, and then remember they left their keys inside. Nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the day a single human male named Tibor Vazari accidentally saved the life of Queen Saraveth Newell of the Molthekian sovereignty, tripped over a drainage pipe on his way out, and somehow ended up engaged. Let me start from the beginning, because the beginning is genuinely the only place where this story makes any logical sense whatsoever. Tibor Vasari was 31 years old, a structural engineer from a city called Budapest on the Central European landmass of Earth. He had curly dark hair, a slight build, and the specific kind of expression worn by a man who is perpetually calculating whether or not something is load-bearing. He was on Molthek Prime for a professional exchange program, one of 17 humans selected to consult on infrastructure projects following the sovereignty's catastrophic bridge collapse of the previous cycle. The Molthekians, it should be noted, are exceptional engineers in atmospheric systems but have a generational blind spot regarding tension cables. Tibor, who had spent 8 years specializing in suspension bridge repair in a country that takes its bridges personally, was there to help. He was not there to become a hero. He was not there to fall into galactic politics. He was absolutely, categorically not there to get married. But the universe, as Tibor himself would later say while stress-eating a plate of goulash he'd had shipped in, quote, has a deeply personal problem with me specifically. The Molthekians are a species of roughly humanoid structure, bilateral symmetry, 2 primary limbs, upright posture. Though they stand approximately 2.5 meters tall on average, with a secondary skeletal framework visible beneath pale, semi-translucent skin, their eyes are compound, amber-tinted, and excellent at detecting structural stress fractures, which is probably why they hired humans for the cable work, since humans are apparently better at ignoring visual feedback and just going by feel. Queen Saraveth Newell was taller than average, which in Molthekian culture signals both genetic distinction and political authority. She had ruled the sovereignty for 19 cycles, survived 2 succession disputes, and negotiated the Yaren Compact that ended a 400-year Cold War with the neighboring Dravathi cluster. She was, in other words, not a delicate flower, which makes what happened next all the more amusing, depending, of course, on your perspective. The bridge inspection tour was a public event, a strategic appearance by the Queen to demonstrate that the sovereignty was addressing the infrastructure crisis with full institutional transparency. 17 humans, 40 Molthekian engineers, 6 diplomatic liaisons, and 1 very uncomfortable press contingent were all assembled on the Vrethkai span, the largest surviving suspension structure in the capital district. Tibor was in the middle of explaining his tension distribution method to a Molthekian engineer named Dolvin Oris, who kept nodding politely while clearly not understanding a word, when the noise started. It was a low, metallic groan that Tibor recognized the way a musician recognizes an instrument going catastrophically out of tune, not loud enough for most ears, not obvious enough for eyes focused on a queen making diplomatic gestures toward a camera lens. But Tibor heard it. He later described the next 4 seconds as basically just instinct. He dropped his datapad. He moved laterally across the inspection walkway at a speed that surprised everyone who assumed structural engineers were sedentary professionals. He grabbed Queen Saraveth Newell by the shoulder, which in Molthekian culture is, we will get to that, and pulled her backward exactly 2.5 meters to the left. The central cable anchor on the right inspection platform chose that precise moment to give way. The platform swung, buckled, and folded downward with a catastrophic metallic shriek, taking with it approximately 6 meters of railing, 2 camera drones, and the Minister of Infrastructure's brand new ceremonial hat. The rest of the walkway held, because, as Tibor immediately noted to anyone within earshot, the load distribution on the secondary cables was actually fine. It was only the anchor housing that was compromised, probably due to improper sealant application at the joint, which he had mentioned in his preliminary report. He was still explaining this when he noticed that every single Molthekian on the bridge had gone completely silent. Not the silence of shock, not the silence of relief, the silence of witnessing something that required immediate cultural processing. Dolvin Oris was staring at Tibor with an expression that, even through compound amber eyes, was readable as pure, unadulterated mortification. Tibor looked down at his hand. His hand was still on the Queen's shoulder. He removed it immediately, with the energy of a man who has accidentally knocked something expensive off a shelf. "I am so sorry," he said, which is apparently the first phrase they teach humans in any diplomatic language course, presumably because it comes up so frequently. Queen Saraveth Null turned to look at him. She was taller by nearly a full head, and her compound eyes caught the light in a way that made the entire moment feel like a nature documentary about something that could absolutely eat you. She studied him with the focused attention of someone doing rapid, high-level calculations. Then she said, in clipped but precise Standard Galactic, "You perceived the failure." "The anchor housing," Tibor said. "The sealant compound. It was in my preliminary report, page 4, section, 'You perceived it,'" she repeated. "And you acted." Yes, I did." She looked at him for another 3 seconds. Then she did something that none of the 40 Molthekian engineers and 6 diplomatic liaisons had ever, in their professional careers, seen a reigning queen do in public. She placed both hands, palm flat, on his upper arms. Dolvin Oris made a sound like a man watching his entire career aspirations fall off a bridge alongside the infrastructure minister's hat. Tibor, who did not know what the gesture meant, said, "Oh," in the way a person says "oh" when they suspect something significant has just happened, but lack the data to quantify it. The press drones that had survived the platform collapse captured the entire thing in high resolution. By the time the inspection party returned to the Capitol building, it was already being broadcast on 7 networks. I was watching from my observation post on level 4 of the diplomatic quarter, eating a nutrient packet and updating my report log, when my colleague HFY nearly knocked over my entire documentation console scrambling to point at the feed. "The human," she said. "He touched her shoulder." "He saved her life," I said. "He touched her shoulder first." I looked at the feed. I looked at the freeze frame. I looked back at HFY. "He doesn't know," I said. "He absolutely does not know." We stared at each other with the shared horror of 2 researchers who have just watched a field subject walk directly into a cultural event horizon. In Molthekian tradition, and I want to be very precise here because precision matters, the act of physical contact initiated on the upper shoulder of a reigning monarch, followed by the monarch's reciprocal palm contact on both arms, constitutes a formal declaration of sovereign bond. It is the equivalent in their legal and ceremonial framework of a public betrothal witnessed by court officials and recorded by the state press. It had not been done in 230 cycles. The last time it happened, it started a succession war. Tibor Vasari, structural engineer, suspension bridge specialist, man who just wanted to look at tension cables, had accidentally proposed to a queen on live television. Now, to be entirely fair to the situation, and I believe in fairness even when the universe clearly does not, there was debate. There was immediately, loudly, and with increasing volume, a great deal of debate. The sovereign court convened within the hour. Legal scholars were summoned. The oldest ceremonial texts were retrieved from the archive. Several ministers argued that the gesture had been made under emergency conditions and therefore carried no legal weight. Several other ministers argued with equal conviction that the emergency conditions were precisely what made it more legally significant, as it demonstrated instinctive recognition of the sovereign's person. Back in his assigned quarters in the diplomatic residential wing, Tibor was receiving this information from Dolvin Oris, who was delivering it with the expression of someone diffusing a very old, very complicated explosive device. "So when she put her hands on my arms," Tibor said, very slowly. "That was reciprocal acknowledgement," Dolven Oris said. "And that means, under the sovereignty's ceremonial legal code, yes." Tibor sat with this information for approximately 4 seconds. "I need to call Budapest," he said. "I'm not sure that will help," Dolven Oris said. "It won't," Tibor agreed. "But I need to do it anyway." His mother's response, once connected, was reportedly, "Tibor, I told you to be careful." This is not helpful context. This is simply what mothers say. The situation escalated, as situations involving accidental royal betrothals on live television tend to do, with extraordinary speed. The 14 other human consultants, to their credit, attempted to be supportive. Priya Nambiar, the team's lead materials specialist, told Tibor that it was probably fine and that the legal scholars would sort it out. Oskar Lindquist, the project manager, said nothing but brought Tibor a cup of coffee with the gravity of a man delivering supplies to a besieged fortress. Fatima El-Rashid, the structural safety auditor, pulled up the relevant ceremonial code on her datapad and began cross-referencing it with galactic diplomatic precedent, because Fatima El-Rashid was the kind of person who responded to crises with research, which is the correct response. Her preliminary finding, delivered at approximately 3 in the morning, was not encouraging. The precedent, she reported, was clear. The gesture sequence was documented. The witnesses were official. The broadcast was public record. The only mechanism for formal dissolution under the existing code required a petition before the full sovereign court, a petition that could only be filed by the bonded party themselves, in person, in the formal tongue of the sovereignty, and only within the first 7 cycles of the acknowledgement. Tibor had 7 days to either navigate Molthekian royal court procedure in a language he did not speak, or become, technically and legally, the consort-elect of a queen who governed 4 planetary systems and 2 asteroid territories. He stared at Fatima's datapad for a long time. "Can I file the petition?" he said, in writing. "No." "Can I do it through a translator?" "The code specifies the bonded party's voice. Can I learn enough formal Molthekian in 7? Tibor. Right. He drank his coffee. Outside, across the capital district, the news feeds were running continuous coverage. The Queen had not issued a statement. The court had not issued a statement. The entire sovereignty was, in the Molthekian way, watching and waiting with the patient intensity of a species that had been doing geopolitics for 3,000 years and understood that the most powerful move was frequently no move at all. Tibor Vazari, structural engineer, looked out his window at an alien sky the color of deep amber, at a city of towers built on tension cables he had flown light years to inspect, and arrived at the quiet, specific conclusion that his life had become structurally unsound. The question was whether it could be repaired, or whether, as sometimes happened with old bridges and new loads, something entirely different was being built. The morning of Cycle 2 arrived with the kind of diplomatic efficiency that only happens when a queen wants something to move. Tibor had slept approximately 3 hours, which for a human is the precise amount of sleep that makes everything feel slightly surreal, but still technically functional. He was on his 2nd coffee, real coffee, the last of a personal supply he had packed with the foresight of a man who knew alien caffeine substitutes were deeply unreliable, when the formal court summons arrived at his door. Not a message, not a notification on his datapad. An actual physical document, rolled into a tube, sealed with what Dolven Oris later confirmed was the Queen's personal sigil in pressed ceremonial resin, delivered by a court official who stood at perfect rigid attention and said absolutely nothing while Tibor accepted it in his bathrobe. He read it, or rather, he looked at it, recognized approximately 4 words, and handed it immediately to Dolven Oris, who arrived 11 minutes later with the expression of a man who had not slept either. "She's requesting a private audience," Dolven Oris said. "Today? 3rd hour. Is that normal?" "Nothing about this is normal." "Great," Tibor said. "What do I wear?" This turned out to be a question of genuine strategic importance. Fatima el-Rashid, who had apparently not slept at all and had instead compiled a 40-page briefing document on Molthekian court protocol, arrived with Priya and Oscar at second hour and proceeded to run Tibor through the essentials at a pace that suggested she had considered the possibility of a quiz. Formal audience attire, she explained, should reflect the visitor's own cultural origin while acknowledging the host's ceremonial context, which in practical terms meant Tibor's best professional clothes, which were his charcoal gray dress suit, slightly creased from interstellar transit, now subjected to Priya's aggressive travel iron skills. Oscar contributed a tie he had brought for the project closing ceremony, a burgundy silk one that his wife had picked out, which Tibor accepted with the solemnity of a soldier borrowing armor. "Do not," Fatima said, as Tibor straightened the tie, "touch her shoulder again. I was not planning to. Do not touch any part of her. Still not planning to. Do not, under any circumstances, make direct compound eye contact for more than 4 seconds at a stretch. It reads as either aggression or what?" Fatima looked at him, or deep romantic interest. Tibor adjusted his tie. 4 seconds, he said. Got it. The royal audience hall of the sovereignty's capital was a structure that Tibor, despite everything, could not help appreciating on a purely professional level. The ceiling alone was an engineering achievement, a suspended lattice of processed stone and load-bearing alloy that distributed weight across 47 independent anchor points, creating a vast open space without a single interior support column. He found himself calculating the tension distribution automatically, the way some people hum without meaning to, as he walked the central approach toward the raised dais where Queen Sereveth Null was already seated. She was not wearing ceremonial armor, which Dolven Oris had told him would signal either war or execution proceedings. She was wearing what he described as administrative formal, layered deep blue garments with structural shoulder framework, which in Molthekian fashion indicated active governance rather than ritual function. Her court was present but positioned at the hall's periphery, far enough to be witnesses, close enough to be officials. Tibor stopped at the indicated distance, bowed at the angle Fatima had drilled into him, and waited. The queen looked at him with those amber compound eyes for precisely 3 seconds. Then she said, in standard galactic and with what Tibor would later describe as a tone that was not unkind, which surprised me, "I am processing a significant amount of new information," Tibor said, which was the most diplomatically accurate thing he had ever said in his life. Something shifted in her expression. It was not a smile. Molthekians do not smile the way humans do. The musculature is different. But there was a quality to it that registered, even cross-species, as something adjacent to amusement. "Sit," she said, and indicated a low seat that had been placed at a respectful but conversational distance from the dais. Tibor sat. She leaned forward slightly, which Dolven Oris had told him was the posture of a Molthekian, indicating they wished to speak plainly rather than formally. "You read my secondary cable tension report," Tibor said, because his brain sometimes moved faster than his discretion. She paused. "Yes, the anchor housing failure was specifically flagged on page 4. It was reviewed," she said, with a quality in her voice that suggested someone was going to have a very unpleasant career conversation soon. "I'm not saying that I just—" He stopped, reorganized. "I'm not sure what I'm doing here, Your Majesty, politically. I understand what the ceremony means. I understand I may have created a legal situation that neither of us intended. I came here to look at bridges." "Yes," she said. "I know, and I'd like to, ideally, continue looking at bridges." "I know that too." He looked at her. 3 seconds, then redirected as instructed, and tried to read a face that evolution had built on entirely different principles than his own. "What do you want, Your Majesty? Honestly, not ceremonially." There was a long pause. In Molthekian court protocol, long pauses are not uncomfortable. They are a sign that the speaker is treating the question with appropriate weight. Tibor, who came from a culture where silence in conversation is socially alarming, sat through it by focusing on the ceiling lattice and counting anchor points. "The sovereignty," she said finally, "is watched." by allies who count our stability, by rivals who count our weaknesses. What happened on the Vrethkai span was witnessed publicly, a bonded acknowledgement, freely given, freely returned. If dissolved by petition, it reads, to those who are watching, as rejection, as instability at the sovereign level. Political optics, Tibor said. Yes, he absorbed this. And if it's not dissolved, then it reads, she said, as the sovereign demonstrating that the sovereignty values those who protect it. Regardless of origin, Tibor was quiet for a moment. That's a very elegant framing of a situation that started because I heard a cable anchor failing. You perceived something others did not, she said. And there was something in her voice now that was genuinely and without diplomatic performance, direct. You acted when acting was costly. That is not a small thing, Tibor Vasari. It was the first time she had used his name, he noticed. He suspected she intended him to notice. What exactly, he said carefully, would a consort-elect actually do, in practice, day to day? And here, for the first time since the previous morning, Queen Saraveth Nul of the Molthekian sovereignty did something that her court, her ministers, and her diplomatic liaisons had not seen her do in a formal setting in 19 cycles of rule. She laughed. It was not a human laugh. It was a series of short, resonant pulses from somewhere in her secondary vocal structure, low and rhythmic. But every person in that hall knew exactly what it was, and two junior court officials in the back immediately exchanged a look of pure bewilderment. You would, she said, once she had recovered her composure, be expected to complete your infrastructure assessment. Obviously, attend a minimum of 4 formal court appearances per cycle. That's manageable. Refrain from publicly contradicting sovereign policy. I can do that as long as sovereign policy doesn't involve ignoring structural reports. Another pulse of laughter, shorter this time, more controlled but genuine. And, she said, you would be expected to produce a full remediation plan for the Vrethkai span and the 17 secondary structures flagged in your preliminary assessment. Tibor stared at her. You read the whole report, he said. I read everything relevant to the sovereignty's stability, she said. Structural and otherwise. He sat back, looked at the ceiling again. 47 anchor points, each one load-bearing. Each one part of a system that only worked because every component was doing exactly what it was designed to do. This is not, he said slowly, how I expected this conversation to go. What did you expect? I expected someone to tell me how to file the petition and which words to say, and then I'd go back to looking at cables. Would you like to do that? He was quiet for 4 seconds, then 6. Then somewhere around 9 he stopped counting and just sat in the silence the way he sometimes sat with a structural problem, not forcing it, letting the load distribute naturally until the answer became obvious. Can I have until tomorrow morning? He said. Yes, she said, without hesitation. And in the meantime, can someone show me the anchor housing on the Prethvik span? Because based on the construction dates in my report, it has the same sealant compound, and I'd rather— Dolvan Oris, the Queen said without raising her voice, and the engineer materialized from the periphery of the hall with the speed of a man who had been anxiously waiting to be useful. Take Engineer Vasari to the Prethvik span. Yes, Majesty. Tibor stood, bowed at Fatima's approved angle, and turned to leave. Then he stopped. Your Majesty. Yes, the ceiling lattice in this hall. The northeast quadrant, 3rd tier of anchors. I'd want to look at the joint sealant there too, if that's— whenever there's time. The Queen followed his gaze upward to the northeast quadrant. Is it urgent? She said. Probably not, Tibor said. But I'd rather know than not know. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he was getting, very gradually, better at reading. So would I, she said. He spent the rest of the day on the Prethvik span, which was indeed showing early-stage anchor housing degradation in the primary cable joints, caught early enough to be repairable without closure, which Tibor explained to Dolvan Oris with the specific relief of a man who prevented a problem rather than responded to one. He filed a preliminary note. He requested materials, He ate something Priya had brought him that was technically alien but tasted approximately like a slightly confused potato, which he appreciated. At some point around the 8th hour, standing on the span with wind moving through the cables in a low structural hum, Dulvin Oris said, quietly, "For what it is worth, she does not laugh. Not in court, not publicly." He paused. "Not in a long time." Tibor looked at the horizon, where the amber sky of Molthek Prime was deepening toward whatever color it turned at night. A color he still didn't have a name for. "The northeast anchor housing in the audience hall," he said. "Is there someone I can email a recommendation to, or does it have to go through formal channels?" Dulvin Oris made a sound that was, unmistakably, a Molthekian version of a sigh. "I will find out," he said. The next morning, Tibor Vazari, structural engineer, suspension bridge specialist, accidental royal betrothed, submitted 2 documents simultaneously to 2 different desks in the Molthekian capital district. The first was a comprehensive remediation plan for the Vrethkai span and 16 secondary structures, including material specifications, phased repair timelines, and a strongly worded appendix about anchor housing sealant standards that he titled, with professional precision, "Why This Keeps Happening and How to Stop It." The second was a letter to the Sovereign Court, written in Standard Galactic, formally and voluntarily withdrawing his petition for dissolution of the Sovereign Bond Acknowledgement. He attached a personal note to the Queen, not formal, not ceremonial, 1 page, that said, in its entirety, "I have looked at a lot of bridges. The ones that last are not the ones that were never stressed. They are the ones that were built to carry the load they were actually given. I would rather be useful here than correct somewhere else. Also, the northeast quadrant of the audience hall ceiling needs attention before next winter cycle. I have included the specifications." TV. Queen Saraveth Null read it twice. Then she forwarded the ceiling specifications to the Royal Maintenance Office with a priority designation that had not been used since the last succession dispute. And somewhere in the observation level of the diplomatic quarter, I, Voreth Kai, senior observation analyst, 3rd cast of the Interstellar Ethnographic Bureau, updated my report with a note I had never written in 943 previous entries. I wrote, "Subject demonstrates consistent behavior pattern, identifies structural failure, acts to prevent it, then stays to fix what was already broken. Recommend extended observation period, possibly indefinite." Then I looked over at HFY, who was watching the same feed, eating her nutrient packet with the look of someone who had just watched the most improbable load-bearing calculation in the history of galactic engineering somehow hold. "He's staying," she said. "He's staying," I confirmed. She was quiet for a moment. "Do you think he knows," she said, "that in Molthekian ceremonial tradition, a consort who personally improves the structural integrity of the Sovereign's Hall is considered to have formally accepted the bond in the deepest possible sense?" I thought about Tibor Vasari, who had flown across the galaxy to look at cables, saved a queen by instinct, and was even now sending strongly worded engineering recommendations to a royal maintenance office. "No," I said, "absolutely not. Should we tell him?" I considered the ceiling lattice specifications, the northeast anchor housing, the remediation plan, the withdrawn petition, and the look that had been on the Queen's face when she read 1 page of plain, direct, load-bearing honesty. "I think," I said, "it will come up naturally, and that, across 14 star systems and 944 field reports, is the story of how a structural engineer from Budapest became the first human consort in the history of the Molthekian sovereignty. Not by being brave, exactly, and not by being clever, and certainly not by any plan he made on purpose, but by hearing what no one else heard, acting when acting was costly, and understanding in that specific way that the best engineers always understand, that the structures worth saving are never the ones that were never in danger. They are the ones that held.